I want to talk today about colour pencils and go over all of the absolute basics that you need to know as a beginner colour pencil artist. I want to go right back to the basics. Let's assume that you don't know anything about colour pencils. Now I am going to cover in this video not only the materials that you'll need, but also the very important techniques you should use, as well as the general process of drawing a picture. Now I should mention that this is a sort of summarised version. I've included the most important parts, but I haven't gone into a huge amount of detail because I'm trying to fit it all in a roughly 10-minute video. I do also have a much more detailed and longer course available on Skillshare, where I not only go into more detail on all of the topics I'll talk about today, but I also go through some actual examples, and together on the Skillshare course we go about drawing an apple. Do check out the link in the post. It includes a 30-day trial of Skillshare, which is more than enough time to do the course, and you can cancel at any time. Alright, so let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about the materials you'll need. Now first up, and what you would probably think of as the most important material, is colour pencils. Now there's a huge amount of variety on the different colour pencils that you could use and buy, and although I do prefer some colour pencils over other colour pencils, I would really work within your budget. Probably the most important thing that I would do is try and get a set of pencils with a reasonable amount of colours. Now I generally like using something like Prismacolor or Polychromos, but it is also perfectly possible to draw some really lovely pictures using Crayola, so you don't need to spend an absolute fortune to start drawing with colour pencils. And there is a material that I think is much more important than colour pencils, that is the paper. You'll find it much easier to draw a really nice picture on specialist artist paper than on something like printer paper. With printer paper you're just not able to use a lot of the techniques that I'll show you a bit later in this video. So I personally like using Bristol board, and I have linked below all of the materials that I like using, but it's probably a case of trying out a few different papers and seeing which one you find suits your style. Now the next most important thing that you want to think about is a pencil sharpener. It is so important for pretty much all of the colour pencil techniques to have a sharp pencil. It doesn't need to be a particularly fancy pencil sharpener like this one. You could use something much cheaper from just a craft store like this. As long as it gives the pencils a nice sharp point, that is what you need. Next up, if you want to learn to draw realistic art, you will have a much easier time of it if you draw from a reference photo. Because I focus on drawing realistic objects, everything I draw is from a reference. And what you'll need is a way of looking at that reference photo. So I always use my iPad, but you don't have to use that. You could look at the reference photo on your phone, or you could print out a copy of the reference photo. You just want some way of looking at it. Last thing that is probably one of the most important tools that you'll need is something that you can't buy but you will need to make. I am talking about colour swatches. Now something that will help you massively early on is to know that you can't rely on the colour of the outer casing to tell you what the pencil is going to look like. Although it kind of gives you a rough guide, I frequently find that the colour the pencil actually is quite different to the colour of the casing. So what I do is I grab a sheet of paper, the same kind of paper that I will later be drawing on, and I swatch out all of my colours. So I go for each colour as light as each colour can go to as dark as each colour can go, and then I label it. I do this in quite an organised way, but you don't have to do this. I just like to see in front of me exactly what all of these colours actually look like. And this makes life 10 times easier. You'll see why a little bit later on. The last kind of optional item that I sometimes like drawing with is a jelly roll pen. This is really good for going over the top of colour pencil and adding in any final white details, any glints of light or anything. Because white colour pencils don't go over the top of darker colour pencils, if you want to add light in at the end, this is a really good option to do that. So that's all of the kind of core materials that you'll need to start drawing. Let's think about some of the key techniques. Now, the most important technique that you need to learn above all others is layering. Layering is where you gradually build up the colour very lightly using very light layers of pencil, rather than just going in really hard with the pencil, pressing really hard. This not only builds up a softer, more consistent colour, but it also is a very forgiving way of drawing. It means that if you make a mistake, it's much easier to correct. If you go in really hard with the pencil to start with, then you're you've committed to that colour, there's no going back. Now you'll also find with layering that this is your way of mixing colours. If you were using paints, you'd be able to mix the colour on a palette and then apply it to the canvas, but all mixing with colour pencils need to happen on the paper. Particularly when you're drawing realistic objects, you're going to want to make a lot of gradients, you want to gradually work from one colour towards another. Generally speaking, if you're drawing an apple, for example, there's not hard sections of red and hard sections of yellow. It kind of fades from one area to another. So layering allows you to do that. So as far as how to actually layer, the number one thing that I want to do is work smoothly. I want to be able to control how lightly the pencil is going down and get it down in as smooth and consistent way as possible. Now there's a few ways that I can go about doing this. First up, I want to hold the pencil further back. I don't want to hold it really close to the tip. Because the key is to press really lightly, if you hold the pencil further back, it's not possible to press hard. If you're holding it near the tip, then you have to have a lot more control over the pencil. It'd be much harder to use the pencil in as consistent a way. The next thing I want to do to try and get it as smooth as possible is to work in circular motions. So rather than going up and down and scribbling with the pencil, I work in circular motions, or almost like oval marks, to make it look as smooth and consistent as possible. This will just help get a more even distribution of the pencil. The last thing I really want to make sure that I'm always doing is having a nice sharp pencil. It's far easier to control those first two parts with a sharp pencil. So that's the kind of general basic technique that I use for drawing with colour pencils. Let's roughly touch over the whole process I use from beginning to an end of a drawing. So the first thing I do is try and find a reference photo. I tend to be looking for a photo that has really good contrast. If I can select a good quality photo, it'll end up being a much better drawing. And then once I've selected that reference photo, I really want to take the time to study it. Now, a lot of learning to draw, not only with colour pencils, but just generally, is learning how to see. You want to draw what you actually see and not what you think you see. So by taking the time to really look at the reference photos, to really notice where the darker areas are, the lighter areas are, if there's any obscure colours in the reference photo, that's going to end up making life easier when it comes to drawing it. Now from there, I like to get a sketch down on the paper, and I generally use the grid method. This is where you draw a grid on your drawing paper and you draw a grid on your reference photo, and then you just work one square at a time, just drawing what's in each square. This helps to get the proportions of what you're drawing as accurate as possible. Now in actuality, with something like an apple, it wouldn't be too bad to draw this freehand, but usually grid method is my go-to. So once I've got a very light sketch down on the paper, I can then think about adding some colour. So what I like to do is take those swatches that I mentioned much earlier on and compare them to my reference photo. And I want to begin by building up some base layers. So I look for the absolute lightest colour that I can see in my reference photo. I then see which colour is closest to this on my swatch sheet, and that is the colour that I will start with. I then, using circular motions, pressing very lightly, holding the pencil further back, begin putting that colour down. And I put that colour everywhere where I can see even a hint of it on the reference photo. I then once again compare my drawing to my swatches, find the next darkest colour, and again put that everywhere where I can see it on the reference photo. And I keep working my way through as I gradually get through darker colours. Now once I get to the darkest colour, it's at this point that I want to think about beginning working my way back towards the lighter colours. Now, generally speaking, I would use the same colours, although not necessarily in the same order. That said, I am constantly checking my drawing against the reference photo and thinking which colour is missing. Because it could be that I've missed a very prominent colour on my way going down through the colours. So I can then work my way back up to the lightest colours, and when I get to that lightest colour, the colours that I used at the very beginning of the base layers, I can then think about pressing getting a bit firmer. This kind of blends it all together and smooths everything out. What I'm doing here is called burnishing. But I can't stress enough, I wouldn't do this until the absolute end, until I'm happy with all of the layers I've built up. Because once I've gone over and burnished, it's much more difficult to add more colours over the top. Now the absolute last thing that I do is any finishing touches. So for example, on an apple, they generally have these little white spots. So in this case, I went through with the Jelly Roll pen and added in those white spots. But it could be a whole host of different things. If I was drawing a portrait, I might need to add in some little flyaway hairs, or maybe add a bit of a glint of an eye on an animal. I'm just generally looking for any last details that's really going to help make the drawing pop. So that, in a nutshell, hopefully will act as a bit of an introduction to colour pencils. Now, as I say, this was just a very short, condensed version of my Skillshare course. Please do check that out. I go into loads more detail and really go into a lot of detail on how I went about drawing this apple. Do check out the link in the description. Now, as I mentioned, layering is, in my opinion, the most important skill to learn when it comes to colour pencils. So if you'd like to go through that in a bit more detail with me, check out the video here. As always, happy drawing, guys. I'll see you in the next one.